Most people can tell when a relationship is starting to change, not because something has gone wrong, but because something feels heavier than it used to. The conversations last a little longer. The pauses carry more weight. There's a sense that what happens next actually matters now. That's often when the distance starts to appear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to take the edge off. Messages come a bit later. Plans feel less definite. Emotional availability gets rationed. From the outside, this can look like confusion or loss of interest. From the inside, it usually feels like trying to stay steady. What's easy to miss is that this kind of pulling away rarely starts because the relationship is failing. It often starts because it's deepening. When relationships are light, there's room to drift in and out. Closeness is optional. Presence is flexible. But as things deepen, that flexibility narrows. Expectations don't always get spoken, but they get felt. Being there starts to matter more. Absence starts to register. Consistency becomes noticeable, and for some people, that shift creates tension. Not fear exactly, not panic, just a quiet sense that the emotional stakes are rising faster than they know how to manage. Pulling back lowers those stakes. Distance restores a sense of balance. That's why the withdrawal is usually measured. It's not about ending things. It's about regulating them. Enough closeness to keep the connection alive. Enough distance to keep it from feeling overwhelming. Often, the person pulling away doesn't consciously think of it as avoidance. They tell themselves they're tired, busy, overextended. They might even believe they're being responsible, not promising more than they can give. And sometimes that's partly true, but it also sidesteps something harder to sit with. That closeness itself has started to feel like pressure. Deepening relationships don't just ask for time, they ask for emotional continuity, for being reachable, for being affected, for being known in ways that can't be easily undone. That kind of visibility can be unsettling. When things are casual, it's easier to stay compartmentalized. Different parts of the self stay separate. Reactions don't have to be fully integrated. Closeness collapses those compartments. Patterns become harder to ignore. Avoidance shows up more clearly. Emotional limits get exposed. The ways someone manages discomfort stop being private. Distance allows those patterns to blur again. It softens the edges. There's also the role that independence plays. Some people learn early that relying on themselves is safer than relying on others. They get good at managing their own emotions, at staying contained, at not asking for too much. That self-sufficiency often becomes part of how they understand their strength. But deep relationships complicate that story. They introduce interdependence, not dependence, but mutual impact. What one person feels starts to matter to the other. Absence creates ripples. Withdrawal gets noticed. For someone who equates stability with self-containment, that can feel destabilizing. Pulling away preserves the version of themselves that feels familiar. It keeps the relationship from asking questions they don't feel ready to answer. Another piece of this pattern is emotional intensity. As relationships deepen, emotions tend to amplify. Affection becomes sharper. Doubt becomes louder. Attachment brings vulnerability with it. Distance dampens that intensity. It quiets things down. For someone who already carries a lot internally, that quiet can feel like relief. And relief has a way of reinforcing behavior. If closeness brings discomfort and distance brings calm, the pattern teaches itself. Pulling away starts to feel like the reasonable response. not because the relationship is unsafe, but because it's unfamiliar territory. Familiar coping strategies usually feel safer than new emotional demands. Over time, the relationship adapts to this rhythm. It moves forward in small increments, then pauses. Depth increases, then retreats. Connection remains, but only up to a certain point. There's still care, still contact, still shared moments. But there's a ceiling the relationship doesn't easily pass. The person on the other side often feels that ceiling first. They sense the hesitation, the way things don't quite settle, the feeling that something keeps pulling back when closeness starts to form. They may try to close the distance, thinking reassurance or presence will help, but that often intensifies the pattern. What feels like care to one person can feel like pressure to the other. From the inside, this doesn't usually feel like avoidance or sabotage. It feels like maintaining balance, like keeping things from tipping too far in any direction. Pulling away becomes the way stability is preserved, not because closeness is unwanted, but because it carries demands that feel difficult to sustain. This is why the pattern can persist for a long time. Nothing collapses outright. The relationship doesn't necessarily end, it just stops deepening. And because there's no dramatic failure, the pattern rarely gets examined. Distance becomes normal. The limits feel fixed. The relationship settles into what it can sustain. From the outside, it might look like someone who can't commit or won't lean in. From the inside, it often feels like someone doing their best to stay regulated in a situation that's slowly asking more than they know how to give. That's what makes this pattern hard to change. Not a lack of care, not a lack of awareness, but a quiet preference for what feels manageable, even when it keeps closeness just out of reach.